Welcome back, Wayfinders. This video is going to be about how I get such clean handle fit-ups on my knives. I'll start with a disclaimer that I am an amateur bladesmith. I do these things at home with no formal training, literally watching YouTube videos, ordering the equipment, and trying things until I find something that works. The focus of this video will be how to make that tang line up nicely with your handle splines and how to make these pins fit perfectly without the holes being wallowed out. I'm using African blackwood for the scales, and I have 3 mosaic pins and 2 brass accent pins for the handle. These scales are a bit too small. I'm going to end up having to trim the handle just a hair at the pommel, but the pins look like they're going to work just fine. This first trick that I use helps me line up the pins consistently. I use a bit of hot glue around the edge of the tang so that the knife cannot move around. This does get stuck to the wood and you do have to remove it later, but allows you to drill this on a drill press and get perfectly centered holes. I'm also going to take this time here to set up the jaws for my vise. Now these are scrap wood sacrificial jaws. I'm actually using a little bit of MDF here that I pulled out of the bin to allow myself to create jaws that will squeeze down on the handle scales without putting pressure on the pins. If you try to clamp it down on the pins, you'll never put enough pressure on the scales to get a nice tight adhesion to the tang. Basically, this just goes in the vise so that when I squeeze this down and leave it overnight for glue up, I'm not putting pressure on those pins. It's important here to ensure that the pieces that you glued onto your scrap wood are equal thickness so that they squeeze evenly across the entire length of that handle. We'll set that aside now that it's done and work on drilling these on the drill press. Each time I drill one, I'm going to place the pin in it so that I don't lose where that hole is on the scale. Otherwise, this may drift around even with the glue. Here it is with all the pins drilled through and placed. As you can see, they line up perfectly, so we can take them out and start working on that scale. A quick cut over the glue gives us an approximate handle shape. I keep it a little proud of the tang because we're going to grind the wood down to the tang versus grinding the tang to the wood. It's just a little easier that way. This is a good time to mark the inside portions of those scales so that you don't get them mixed up. While they should be identical, there's always minor inconsistencies. Gluing them together allows me to finish drilling those holes through to the other side so that they all line up with the tang. And just as I did before, I put a pin in before I drill the next hole, allowing for perfect fit up. Now all that's left is to trim off the rest of that excess blackwood so that we have our rough handle shape. With the scales drilled and ready, we're going to go ahead and clean them up and make sure they're perfectly flat. I use a knife to get it roughed in, and then I'll take a piece of sandpaper on a flat surface to make sure that I don't have any protrusions or anything that's going to prevent this from marrying up with that tang once I start epoxying it. When talking with other bladesmiths, I find that a lot of people have different opinions on what epoxy is best to use on this, so I went ahead and removed my label so that we wouldn't have an argument about it in the comments. I go overboard with my epoxy. I make sure I coat the entire thing. I make sure that the epoxy is getting down in those holes so that they can hold the pins in place, and then I let the excess epoxy get squeezed out during the clamping process. It's a little messier this way, but it makes me sleep better at night knowing that I have complete coverage versus having some air pockets in there or some weaknesses that I don't know about. There's no reason to do all the pins at the same time. I just had them and this is the way I did it. I don't always do it this way. I don't know why I did it this time. Usually I'll put the scale on and then insert one pin at a time, moving the scales around until they fit. But this did end up going together fairly easily, so I can't complain. If you look closely on the bottom right, you can see where the tang protrudes past the handle. That's not normal. That's the part that I'm going to have to grind off because my scales weren't large enough. So quickly before this epoxy sets, let's grab that vise and these sacrificial vise jaws. It seems that each knife that I build has a slightly different pin pattern, so I'm building these and throwing them away all the time. The hot glue here isn't structural, it's just to hold it in place while I tighten, so that I'm not trying to hold multiple pieces of wood in place at the same time. And again, you're going to make a mess here, so be willing to drip epoxy on whatever is below the vise at this point. I tighten this down medium to hard. I know when woodworking with wood glue, you can squeeze too much wood glue out, and if you clamp too hard, you can actually weaken your joints. I don't know if that applies here with epoxy, but I follow the same principle of medium to hard clamping with all of my projects. It's not obvious here, but I let it sit for an entire 24 hours to film this next piece. I popped it out all in one big chunk. The epoxy has glued everything together, so you have to work your way through those blocks. Luckily, like I said, they're sacrificial. You just break them off and throw them away. So there you have it, a beautiful, completely done knife handle. Nothing else needs to be done at this point, except all the hours and hours of finishing work. So the first little bit that you watched took me about 30 to 45 minutes. This next bit, where I'm using a side grinder to knock off the large chunks of epoxy and trim the pins, and then final hand sanding, took me about 3 to 4 hours. Some are going to cringe at the use of a side grinder here, but it does an excellent job of marrying up the surfaces as long as you don't let it get too hot. To be clear, I did zero handle shaping with the side grinder. I only cut the pins down and then went down the spine. A few passes on the large belt sander gets me a rough shaped handle. I usually just take off the corners here, but it does tend to bite in and leave these marks that I'm sanding off right here. I'll start with an 80 grit sandpaper to do rough shaping, run to 150, then 220, then 400, and then I skip to 1000 before buffing on the buffing wheel. I know they look high gloss here, but there's no finish, there's no oil. This is purely sanded and then buffed on the buffing wheel. So they do look sealed at this point. They're not. This is just the way that African Blackwood comes out if you spend enough time shining it down and buffing it. And yes, I'm aware that some of you are going to be irritated that the pins don't match perfectly, but these are not a matching knife set. They'll be in the same kitchen. I just want them to be similar. The cleaver inherently has a shorter handle because you hold it differently than when using the kitchen knife, and the kitchen knife has a longer handle, which I believed merited another 8mm mosaic pin. If you're watching on your phone, you may not be able to see the detail of those pins, but they're tri-metal. There's brass, copper, and stainless steel tubes inlaid in epoxy, and they look absolutely phenomenal up close. So there are your tips and tricks from an amateur bladesmith on how to make your handle fit up just go a little bit more smoothly.